The group we're discussing now is a group called the Ebionites. This is a very ancient group, a very early group, I'll change that, early group of Christians who did not believe that Jesus was born of a virgin, and he certainly didn't believe he was God. The gospel that they are said to have believed in was the Gospel of Matthew without the first 3 chapters, essentially. They believed in what's called that Jesus became the Son of God when he was adopted at his baptism. It's called adoptionist theology. It's the theology that that maps best onto the book of Mark, where we're introduced to Jesus as an adult. Whoever wrote the book of Mark did not think there was anything unusual about Jesus' conception or his birth or the city he was born in. And therefore, we're only introduced to Jesus at his baptism, where Jesus is told directly, "You are my son," in the first person. It means Jesus discovers this at his baptism. So, in essence, the idea is that Jesus was a very, very righteous person. This is what a very early version of Christianity believed, which probably the Ebionites believed, and I'll explain why in a moment. That Jesus was a very, very righteous, very great person, and God therefore adopted him, chose him to be his son, and the ceremony, the event at which God adopts Jesus to be his son, is at his baptism. So he was born out of the ordinary union of a man and a woman. In this case, it would be the sexual union of Mary and Joseph. And there was nothing unusual, therefore, about his conception, and nothing striking about his birth, nothing about that at all. Now, this group, the questioner asks is, why does the Catholic Church not talk about them? Well, I wouldn't say they don't talk about this group, the Ebionites. They just don't like them because they were considered a heresy, and they were sharply hated as a heresy. A disclosure must be said now. None of the writings of the Ebionites themselves survived. Everything we know about them is from their opponents. You can only imagine how that might affect our view of them. But it is unlikely that church fathers of the 2nd century who discuss them, such as Irenaeus, he was an extremely important early church father. He was a bishop in what is today France. He's extremely important. The Ebionites are mentioned by Tertullian, very similar time, end 2nd century. They are probably referred to by Justin, who is an even earlier church father. But they're all 2nd century. So therefore, everything we know about them is from their opponents. However, then you can ask the question, well, how do I know anything? How do I believe them? Well, the answer is it's inconceivable that church fathers would ever invent such a schism, because it's embarrassing. And therefore, this criteria of embarrassment that therefore tells us that all the church fathers that discuss the Ebionites were very aware who they are, and this is at least what the Ebionites believed. Origen would have never made this up. So we have to accept what we are told in the patristic writings. The Ebionites are a very early expression of Christianity. They did not believe that Jesus was God or divine in any way. When the so-called Messianic movement today, this is a modern movement that's essentially a half a century old, not even. When the Messianic movement says that we go back to the original followers of Jesus, and we, the Messianic movement, really reflect the beliefs of the real, true, authentic followers of Yeshua and all these things, that is nonsense. The Messianic movement is a hybrid, is a machination that was spawned by the Christian Protestant movement that believes in every modern improvement, in italics and quotation marks, of the church, meaning that the Messianic movement believes the exact same thing that the Southern Baptists do. Same thing. They believe that or the Assemblies of God might believe if you want to go on the charismatic side. They believe that Jesus was God, he was the second person of the Trinity, that he was conceived to a Virgin Mary and born in Bethlehem to Mary. And they believe that he was absolutely fully God, fully equal to the Father. They believe in the ideas that were expressed about the nature of Jesus at the Council of Nicaea by those who oppose the Arians. The word Arian there is spelled with an I, not like the Nazis are spelled with a Y. Different, same sound, different spelling. So the Ebionites completely rejected all the innovations, the notion that Jesus was born of a virgin. That's a later invention. Paul never mentions in any of his writings those that are disputed or those that are not disputed, that means 13 letters, that there's anything unusual about Jesus' conception or birth. It is inconceivable that Paul believed that Jesus was born to a virgin, but he just didn't think that was important enough for him to mention. That's a later innovation. I call it an improvement. The Ebionites rejected any notion that Jesus was divine. Now, some people watching this show may say, well, Paul did believe that Jesus was divine. As it turns out, I'm not going to go too deep in this because I don't want to go too far away from our starting point, but Paul believed that Jesus was divine, not in the sense that we would conventionally say that today, but rather that he was God's firstborn son. But he was not eternal and equal with the Father. Paul never held such a thing. In fact, Paul repeatedly expresses his belief that there was a hierarchy and Jesus was above the church and the Father is above Jesus. However, God did grant to Jesus the honors that are attributed to God. We find that in what's called the Carmen Christi of Philippians 2. It's a Greek Platonic understanding of the Son of God. It has nothing to do with the Son of God in the traditional sense of Tanakh. It has nothing to do with the concept of the Son of God in modern Orthodox Christianity. This may seem confusing. The point is that the Trinity, as it is promulgated today in the Orthodox Church, lowercase o, is something that was unknown to the early Christians, and therefore it is obvious that as we walk back Christianity further and further, what we would expect to discover is exactly what we find. As you move back to a very early stage of the church, where the Ebionites in this case, we would discover a version of Christianity that's less elaborate, that does not have the improvement, does not postulate that Jesus was divine in any sense. The Ebionites would have been hated by Paul, and Paul, incidentally, in both the letters that we are sure that come from the hand of Paul, and those that are disputed, the 6 that we're not sure about, but Paul is running against this kind of thinking, because the Ebionites also insisted that a Christian had to keep the law of Moses. They believed that Jesus died for your sins, but they did not believe that because Jesus the Messiah came and preached his teaching and then died, that Christians no longer have to follow the Torah, the commandments that are expressed in the Torah. This is very, very important to the Ebionites. The Ebionites believed that the Torah of Moses was still completely binding, and there's nothing about Jesus's ministry, life, death, nothing about that would mitigate, that would free anyone from observing the commandments of God, that would nullify them in any way. Now, Christians may say, well, we believe in the law and Jesus fulfilled the law for us. These are talking points, but they don't map onto reality. Christians, except for some very unusual sects, don't keep Shabbos, they don't keep the law. The Ebionites insisted that you had to keep the commandments, that nothing about Jesus nullified that. They would have found Matthew 5:17 very attractive. The Sermon on the Mount would have made a lot of sense to them. Do not think that I've come to destroy the law. I didn't come to destroy the law, but to fulfill the law. Anyone who changes one jot or one tittle of the law will be least in the kingdom of heaven. In fact, your righteousness would have to exceed that of the Pharisees and the scribes. Now, Christians quote this, and they'll nod their head. They're doing it right now, watching me say this. But even though these words to someone who's not a Christian could only mean one thing, it means that you keep the Torah. That means that you keep Shabbos, or you keep the commandments expressed in the Torah. To the Orthodox Christian, it doesn't mean that. To a person who is otherwise completely rational about what these simple words mean, will reject this because it's not orthodoxy. So the Ebionites, the word, it is disputed of exactly what the word Ebionites means, but probably the word Evion means a poor person. So the Ebionites probably, their name is the poor ones. So as I said, nothing written by the Ebionites survives. It is very likely they did right, but there would be no reason for Christendom to ever copy. Scribes were not interested in copying heresies. Publishing the work of a heresy would make no sense to an early Christian. And copying a manuscript, that's what they're handwriting a text, was a major undertaking. Imagine if you had to copy a 28-chapter book. That's a very serious business, and not using Microsoft Word, but using a quill on a piece of organic material, vellum, or whatever. So the church didn't copy texts that they considered of the heresies, and what we know about the heresies are only known through the opponents of these heresies. As I said, these heresies, no doubt, flourished in the early first century, in the early years of the church. The early church fathers of the second century church fathers were opposed to Judaization, to any kind of making Christianity Jewish. To them, they hated Judaism, and they wrote books about this. This is not my biased understanding of the church fathers. They wrote books like Against the Jews. Irenaeus said things that would have got you thrown out of any Christian university today. If you were in Moody Bible Institute as a student or professor and expressed some of the phrases that came out of the mouth of Tertullian, that came from his hand, that have survived, you would be expelled from Houston Baptist HBU in a second. They would throw you out of the school. You would be considered clearly racist and anti-Semitic. So, in essence, they were deeply opposed to any Judaization. They wrote about this extensively because it was a real threat. Tertullian was a real apologist for the church. I mean, he was defending church teachings against those who opposed what he believed to be orthodoxy. Irenaeus was more of a theologian, but I'm not going to go into this. And that's why the Catholic Church never like the Ebionites, consider them a complete heresy. Whatever happened to them, just the last part is, they were crushed, which means by the time we arrive at the 4th century, by the time we arrive at the Council of Nicaea in 325, they had already been completely thrown out of court. That does not mean that no one in the empire identified as an Ebionite or identified with the views of the Ebionites. No doubt there were people of the people who were Christians, which is estimated to be 5% of the empire, as in the years of Diocletian and following Constantine's conversion in 312. But if you were an Ebionite, if you embraced the teachings of the Ebionites or Nazarenes or whatever name you want to attach to this set of beliefs, you were so marginalized that you were crushed almost completely.